All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're picking up right in the middle of the story in John chapter 8, and we'll be looking at John 8:31 through 59. And in this scene that we're at, right in the middle of Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees and Jewish leaders have been pressing Jesus on who he is. And they can't seem to get it that he's calling God his own Father in a very unique sort of way. It's particularly baffling to them that Jesus has referred to himself with the declaration of I am. And they're like, you are what? You are who? What are you talking about? But even so, John, as he writes his gospel, has told us that many of those who have heard Jesus believed in him. And that's where we're picking up in this story in John 8. And what we keep seeing is this mixed response to Jesus. You've got all different types of people in the crowds, and some of them respond positively to Jesus. Some respond ambivalent to Jesus. Some go and report Jesus to the Pharisees. You have leaders in Jerusalem who are deeply hostile towards Jesus. And so what we keep seeing is this mixed response to Jesus. And that's where we pick up. So we're in the middle of this scene. There's been this mixed response, and John has told us that a number of people have believed in Jesus. So we open in John chapter 8, verse 31, with a famous statement from Jesus about discipleship to him for the sake of those who have believed in him. It reads like this, John 8:31. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed in him, notice who he's talking to, those Jews who had believed in him. And Jews may be used here probably in the large sense of people of Judea. That was a specific way to refer to the people of Judea. They are the Jews. But I suspect that John also probably intends to be somewhat consistent, and therefore he may be even referring to some of the Jewish leaders believed in Jesus. And so he was saying to those Jews there in Judea, in and around Jerusalem, who had believed in him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Here is a very famous statement of Jesus about discipleship to himself. And what we see is one of the keys to discipleship here, and that is continuing in Jesus' word. That is his teaching. That's the idea of his word. You continue in his teaching. And the word continue is the word meno in Greek. It has the idea of remain, abide, dwell in. And so a disciple of Jesus dwells in, abides in the teaching of Jesus. And the result of this, Jesus says here in verse 32, is you will know the truth. If you abide in Jesus' teaching, if you remain in it, dwell in it, saturate yourself with it, then you will actually know the truth. That is, you will know the way the world is actually made, the way the world is actually designed to operate. You will know the way human beings are made and the way they're designed to operate. You will know the truth about life and reality. And that truth, Jesus says in verse 32, will set you free, will lead to freedom. And that, in a lot of ways, just makes sense. When something is operating the way it's supposed to operate, it runs freely and properly. When it's not operating the way it's supposed to operate, then there's all sorts of complications and problems, from simple things to big things. And this is true with human existence. There is a way humans are made to operate. That way is the truth. And when we operate on the rails of the truth, then we operate properly and we are free to be the kind of people we were created and designed to be. And so disciples of Jesus remain in Jesus' teaching. That leads them to a knowledge of the truth, and living in the truth leads to being able to live freely the way we were designed to live. Well, the Jews who are listening to Jesus in this kind of crowd with all this mixed people, Jesus speaking these words, particularly to those who have believed in him. But remember, there's a crowd around him, and there's a mixed response in that crowd. Well, all of those in the crowd then react to this idea of freedom. They answered, verse 33, We are Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say we will become free? Now, the Jews standing there know their history as well as anyone. So they know that they've been under foreign rule for over 500 years and, in fact, still are. The Romans are in charge. So what they actually appear to be saying is that we're the ones called by God. We are Abraham's descendants. We're Abraham's seed. We're the children that were promised to Abraham way back in Abraham's day in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 and so on. We're Abraham's descendants. And we have God as our king. That's who we serve. So regardless of what things look like by political and worldly definitions, we're the free children of God's promise to Abraham. That's what they appear to be saying when they say we're Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved to anyone. And so they demand to know, how is it then that you can say we'll become free? So in reply, Jesus makes it crystal clear. Look at verse 34. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin." In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a descendant of Abraham or not. Sinning equals slavery to sin. In fact, Jesus is very precise when he says everyone who commits sin. The word commits literally is doing, and it's present tense. So it has this idea of ongoing action. Like everyone who continues to do sin is a slave of sin. And then Jesus uses an analogy to make a very important and key point. Look at verse 35. He says, "Now, the slave doesn't remain in the house forever, but the son does remain forever." This is the analogy. Sonship versus slavery. And everyone in their world understood this because even though among the Jews slavery wasn't really practiced, among the Romans it was. And so everyone knew this. They knew how this worked. A son was the heir of the household. Someday, he would take over from his father and he would be in charge. Servants and slaves, well, that was not the case with them. In fact, they were often sold or they were sent elsewhere. But the son, he's going to remain in the house forever. As long as he's alive, he's going to be in the house. Someday he'll be in charge of the house. So then Jesus, from that analogy, makes the point. Here's the point, verse 36. So, or literally, therefore, helps us see that he's drawing the implication. Therefore, if the Son sets you free, you will really be free. Jesus himself has frequently referred to himself as the Son, and he's offering as the Son who has authority over the whole house, he's offering to set them free. And in the immediate context, the specific freedom that he offers is freedom from sin, which is what they really need. It's what all of us really need. We're truly enslaved by sin, and Jesus has the position and the authority to set us free from that. That's the point of verse 36. That's the point of the analogy. Jesus is going to remain forever over the household of God, and he has the authority to set us free, specifically free from the authority and power of sin. Now, having made that point, Jesus then goes on to argue that even though they're Abraham's descendants, as they claimed up above, they're still enslaved to sin, and it's evident by their desire to kill him. That's the point he's going to make in the discussion that follows. So let's look at verse 37 and following. It says this, "I know that you're Abraham's descendants." They had just claimed that. Jesus agrees with them. "I know that's the case. Yet, you are seeking to kill me, because my word has no place in you." He knows that there's Jewish authorities and people who are sympathizers to the Jewish authorities who want to eliminate him. They want to get rid of him because they don't believe his teaching. They don't believe what he has taught, specifically what he's taught about himself and who he is. My word has no place in you. I speak the things, Jesus says, which I have seen with my Father. I'm simply speaking what my Father has shown me and taught me, the things I've seen with him. Therefore, you also do the things you heard from your father. Now, when Jesus says this is really a deep challenge. They've claimed to be Abraham's descendants. What Jesus is saying is there's more to being a descendant of Abraham than mere physical descent, more heritage. Yes, by lineage, by heritage, Abraham is their father. But there's more to it than that. Jesus is speaking the things he's heard from his father, and by that he means God. They're doing the things they've heard from their father, and we'll see who Jesus means very shortly. They reply and say to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus responds and says, if you are Abraham's children, then do the deeds of Abraham. That, again, physical descent and lineage is not the only marker whether you are a true child of Abraham. Their actions, their deeds reveal a problem that being merely physical descendants of Abraham simply can't solve. So again, just because they have Abraham's blood flowing through their veins, that by itself does not mean that they're really children of the promise. There's more to being children of the promise than just that. And that's at the heart of what Jesus is saying here. We actually see that same idea being explored in places like Romans chapter 9 and 10 or Galatians chapter 3 in Paul's writings, that there's more to being a child of the promise than just physical descent. It has to do with the kind of person you are, your character. Specifically, do you put your faith in Jesus as the Messiah? So just being a physical descendant of Abraham does not automatically absolve them of all guilt and does not automatically justify their behavior. That's what Jesus is getting at. If you're Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. But Jesus says, verse 40, as it is, you're seeking to kill me. He knows their end game. He knows their heart, their motive. They want to get rid of him. You're seeking to kill me. A man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You're doing the deeds of your father. So Jesus says, I'm telling you the truth. I heard that truth from God, and you don't believe it. My word has no place with you. You don't listen. This is not like Abraham. Abraham actually listened to God, and he believed God. You're not believing me, even though I'm telling you the truth. That's from God. And so Jesus says, you're doing the deeds of your father. Well, they're frustrated by this because all they can think of is they're children of Abraham. So they respond by saying, we're not born as a result of sexual immorality. We have one Father, God. They're defending their ancestry. They're defending their heritage. They're the seed of Abraham. Thus, they say, we're actually children of God by virtue of that birthright. By the fact that we are children of Abraham, we are God's children. But once again, Jesus challenges them. He's trying to get them to see that there's more to being children of God and thus children of God's promise than mere physical descent. So look at verse 42. Jesus said to them, if God really were your father, you would love me. That's simple. If God really were your father, if you really knew God and he really was your father, you would love me. Why? Because I came forth from God and I'm here. For I have not even come on my own, but he sent me. Like it's not just purely my idea. I'm not doing my own thing here. God sent me. Why don't you understand what I'm saying? If they really were born of God and thus had his character within them, they would love Jesus instead of wanting to kill him. And you can actually kind of hear a bit of Jesus' exasperation here. Like, why don't you get this? Why can't you see that I'm saying I'm sent from God? He's my father in a unique sort of way, and I'm here representing him. So he says, why don't you understand this? And then he answers his own question. He says, it's because you can't listen to my word. Why don't you get this? Because you simply cannot hear. You cannot receive my word. For whatever reason, your character is such that you cannot actually hear what I'm saying. You're of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. So they have said, we're God's children. And Jesus keeps saying, no, you're not. You're not, because I can see it in the way you're responding to me, the way you want to kill me and all that. So now Jesus says, your father is actually the devil, and you do his desires. They can't understand Jesus because they're actually of the devil. Their character and their actions make this plain. Their heritage and ancestry says one thing, but their actions actually reveal something completely the opposite. And so Jesus says, you're doing the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning. That's this desire to kill Jesus. That speaks to you having the same kind of heart-set character of the devil himself, because he was a murderer from the very beginning, and he does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. So the devil, he's a murderer. He doesn't buy the truth, and that's just like you guys. That's the point of what Jesus is saying. Whenever the devil tells a lie, he speaks from his own nature, because he is a liar and he's the father of lies. But because I say the truth, you don't believe me. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, just like the devil is a murderer, well, they want to kill Jesus. Just like the devil is a liar, they cannot hear and bear the truth of Jesus' words. And then Jesus actually just asks sort of a rhetorical question that he just throws out there, and let's hang there in the air, right? They want to kill him. And so he says, which one of you convicts me of sin? He just throws the question out there. Convict me of some sin. What have I done wrong? And he just lets it hang there. And then he follows it up with, if I speak truth, why don't you believe me? If you really were of God, you would really love the truth, and then you would believe in Jesus. If I speak truth, why don't you believe me? And then he drives home his point. He says, the one who is of God hears the words of God. If you're actually of God, if you're from God, you believe God, your heart is in line with God's heart, then guess what? You hear the words of God. For this reason, on account of this, you don't hear them because you're not of God. That's the point. They claim to have God as their father, but if that were the case, then they would actually listen to the words of God spoken by Jesus. But the fact is, they don't listen to those words, and that makes it plain that they're not from God. Well, the Jews respond to that with a kind of an accusation of their own, more of like an insult. They say in verse 48, the Jews answered and said to him, do we not rightly say that you're a Samaritan and you have a demon? This is an insult. This is not like an argument. This is now attacking Jesus and his personhood, because they don't have any way to deal with the logic of what he's saying. And in order to feel the force of it, you have to recall the hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans. So to say, didn't we recall that you're a Samaritan? That's like saying, you don't know anything. You don't know the truth. You're an enemy of God's people, and you have a demon, right? The Samaritans were viewed by the Jews as apostates. They were viewed as people who lead others astray. So that's the force of what they're saying by saying he's a Samaritan. And they accuse him of working in league with Satan by having a demon. And so this is an attempt to put Jesus down and bring shame upon him in a public arena, so that he loses credibility, he loses status and honor, and people won't listen to him. That's all this is. Don't we rightly say that you're a Samaritan and have a demon? Jesus answers in verse 49, I do not have a demon. On the contrary, I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Jesus simply reasserts the truth about his identity and his action. He honors God, his Father. They're dishonoring Jesus, which indicates that they're actually dishonoring God. Jesus goes on and says, but I'm not seeking my glory. There is one who seeks it and judges. By seeking to honor God, his Father, Jesus isn't seeking for honor and fame and glory for himself. He's, in other words, I'm not interested in playing your shame and honor game here. I'm not interested in playing your status game. So you want to heap shame on me by making these insults and these accusations? Well, guess what? Doesn't really matter to me, because I'm not seeking my own glory. There is one who seeks it, namely God himself, and there's one who judges. In other words, God is seeking Jesus' own honor. He will sort things out in the end. He's the judge. He will vindicate Jesus. He will defend his honor and his glory. And what really strikes me here is how Jesus simply is calmly dealing with them, their accusations, their threats, their desire to kill him, calmly dealing with them, while at the same time entrusting his honor to God himself. God will be his defender and the one who vindicates him. God is the one who seeks Jesus' glory and honor, and God is the one who will defend it and judge them for their dishonoring of him. Jesus doesn't have to do any of that, so he calmly just deals with it. Then Jesus adds a statement that emphasizes the importance of listening to his words. He says in verse 51, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone follows my word, he will never see death." Now, keep in mind that this whole discussion began with Jesus saying, "If you continue in my word, then you're truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And he's charged them throughout with not listening to him, without continuing in his word. In fact, he said, "My word has no place in you." So this statement in verse 51 really shows how high the stakes are. If they, and anyone, including us, if we will listen to Jesus and follow what he says, that is, if anyone follows my word. So if we'll listen to Jesus and follow what he says, we will not see death. Jesus, in fact, will say something very similar in John chapter 11 when he's discussing the whole idea of eternal life and resurrection and all that. He says that someone who believes in Jesus will live even if he dies. In other words, physical death is not the ultimate kind of death, and there's a life beyond that kind of death. So someone who remains in Jesus' words will live even if he dies physically. Well, the Jews who he's speaking to, who now are, very hostile to him, they completely reject this idea. So verse 52, they say to him, "Now we know that you have a demon," right? Like the fact that you're saying if people listen to you, they will never see death. Now we know that you have a demon. What's their thinking on this? Well, they say, "Look, Abraham died. The prophets, they died as well. And yet you say, if anyone follows my word, he will never taste death. You're not greater than our father Abraham who died, are you? Or the prophets who died too. Whom do you make yourself out to be?" In other words, they look at this, they're saying, Abraham died, the prophets died, so who do you think you are by telling people they'll never die? I mean, how can you, Jesus, you're just simply some 30-something-year-old itinerant teacher. How do you think you're better than Abraham or the prophets? And their thinking seems to be that we know Abraham walked with God. We know the prophets spoke for God, and yet they died. And you're saying that if anyone just listens to you, they won't die at all. Jesus replies to them in verse 54 and says, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. I'm not interested in that. It's my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God, and you have not come to know him, but I know him." Jesus responds by once again simply affirming that he's not making himself out to be anything. He's not trying to gain honor. He's not trying to climb, the status ladder for himself. He'll let God do all that. He's merely just telling him the truth about himself. I know God, and therefore I know I speak for God, and I know the words I say come from God. And so he says, "And if I say I do not know him, I will be a liar just like you. But I do know him, and I follow his words. I'm simply telling you the truth about myself." And then Jesus says something that shocks them. Verse 56, he says, "Your father Abraham was overjoyed that he would see my day, and he saw it and rejoiced." Think back to the story of Abraham in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and places like that. When God promised Abraham that through him and his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, well, Abraham believed that promise, and that indicates he was looking forward to the day when God would fulfill that promise to bless all the nations through his seed. And ultimately, that promise focused on the Messiah. And that's who Jesus is. He's the fulfillment of that promise. And so Abraham was waiting and hoping and looking forward to that day. And that day has come in the person of Jesus. That's what Jesus is getting at in verse 56. Well, they respond to him in verse 57 saying, "You're not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Now, in order to make sense of that, we have to remember our chronology. Abraham lived 2,000 years before Jesus. 2,000 years. Jesus, he's 30-something, right? And so they're like, "What in the world are you getting at? How in the world can you be saying that? You're not even 50 years old. Certainly, Abraham didn't see you, and you haven't seen Abraham." And Jesus says this in verse 58. This is what's truly shocking. He says to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." Now, don't miss this. I am. That's the name of God. That's the name God gives himself in the Old Testament. Jesus, standing there in the flesh, younger than 50 years old, says, before Abraham even came into existence, I am. And what Jesus is saying is so shocking to them, should be so shocking to us, this average, ordinary looking Jewish rabbi who's 30-something years old. He's claiming to have existed before Abraham, who lived 2,000 years before him. And he makes that claim by not just saying, I'm older than Abraham. He makes that claim by ascribing to himself the name of the eternal God, the God who is the ageless one, the God who simply is. The one they just mocked as being less than 50 years old is actually the ageless I am. Therefore, they get the point of this. And so they pick up stones to throw at him. They see this as the height of blasphemy, and they pick up stones to stone Jesus to death. But in keeping with Jesus' authority over the timing of his death, as it's laid out in John's gospel, Jesus somehow hid himself from them and left the temple grounds. And so Jesus escapes their attempts to kill him and walks out because his hour has not yet come. Now, as we wrap up this section, let me just offer a couple reflections. The first is this. It's at the heart of what Jesus says here, and that is, if someone says they believe in God, but they don't accept who Jesus is or listen to his teaching, then they don't really believe in the one true God. They don't know God. That's the force of what Jesus says to these Jews. If you refuse to listen to my word and believe in me, then you really don't know God. And that's deeply challenging and really important for us to hear. That it doesn't matter so much who someone says they believe in. The centerpiece now of believing in God is Jesus himself. And so if someone really loves the truth and loves God, they will necessarily listen to Jesus and follow him. If you don't accept who Jesus is and you don't listen to his word, then you don't know God. The second reflection is the identity of Jesus. Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am. Before Abraham existed, I am. Jesus, standing there in the flesh, sounding like every other Jewish person of the day, looking like every other Jewish person of the day, says, there's far more to me than meets the eye. I am. Jesus is the I am in the flesh. That's the whole point of the teaching of the divinity of Jesus. That somehow, as the Apostle Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, verse 9, in Jesus, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. Jesus is 100% human, but he's also, I am, 100% God. And so his 30-something years on earth is not the sum total of his existence. Before Abraham existed 2,000 years ago, Jesus existed. He is, I am. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Gospel of John. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. Thanks a ton for using your resources to invest in this ministry. God is bearing good fruit through it all around the world. And if you have been blessed or impacted in some way by this ministry and want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, and that page will allow you to set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation. All those monies will come my way to support this ministry, further this work. Another way you can support it is by going to listenerscommentary.com and signing up for the study hub and just choosing an amount to give there. And that will give you access also to some online courses as well as some bonus material inside the study hub. So let me just say in advance, thanks a ton for your support.